I'll invite you to take out your New Testaments, turn to Luke 7, verses 1 through 10. We'll be there in just a few moments. When I was putting these lessons together, it's such a breadth of information, and I was trying to figure out a way to arrange it that would make some sort of logical sense. And so what I tried to do is roughly construct a continuum from those that were antagonistic toward Jesus, those that didn't believe in him, they had their vested interest to reject him, they accused him of various things, and then moving forward to those who did recognize, and at least significantly, if not in totality, they recognized that Jesus essentially was someone that they needed, and that they were willing to accede to Jesus' nature and his teaching and what he could do for them. And as we are sort of working our way through that continuum, I hope the lessons are getting happier, because it's really depressing, to think of being in the presence of God and not getting it. Just, over the head. Being so distracted by the world on the one hand, or filled with traditionalism leading away from true spirituality on the other, or consumed just by greed and materialism, or desire to hang on to power, whatever it was that caused people to hear and see and touch Jesus, some in the very intimate closeness, like Judas, who we talked about already, to be in that association with Jesus and miss the boat. It's very discouraging to see the power of unbelief in human beings. The power of belief is a wonderful thing, but the power of unbelief is strong as well. So in this lesson, I think the happiest of all so far, we're going to talk about those that ask questions of faith and trust in Jesus. Those that saw the worth and the value and the resource that was in Jesus. When Jesus came into the world, he came into a time of imperial despotism, warfare, nations warring with one another, a time of rampant disease, idolatrous ignorance, a time of religious hypocrisy among his own people, as we've documented, a time of misogyny, of violence and oppression against women, a time of slavery, a time of famine and other natural calamities, a time of many man-made ills, which really are the worst thing about this world. It's not the natural catastrophe that befalls from time to time. It's not the hurricane or the tornado or the tsunami. The real evil in this world is what men do to other men. And so this was a world like our own that left many unfulfilled, vulnerable, anxious, and desperate. And so in the first part of the lesson this morning, I want to think about appeals to Jesus of desperation. People that were desperately in need, and they saw in Jesus someone who could help them. Of course, this is also a time in the medical world where basically nothing was known of genetic anomalies, pathogens, antibiotics, humane surgical procedures, hygienic precautions. Hospitals and rehab facilities and other advanced medical care that we so often take for granted simply were not available to those people. And it was even worse. It was a period wherein God had allowed demons to invade human bodies and take them over and cause great misery and injury and just complete breakdown of what an individual is supposed to be by the habitation of demons within. In Matthew chapter 4, verses 23 and 24, as Jesus begins his work in earnest, Matthew records that he went about Galilee, healing all kinds of sickness and disease. Then his fame went throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all sick people who were afflicted with various diseases and torments, and those who were demon-possessed, epileptics, and paralytics, and he healed them all. I've always found it amazing, both in Old Testament and New, how quickly news traveled in primitive times without satellites, without cell phones, without the kind of communication and information available to us that we have. Word traveled very quickly. And given the state of the plight of man at this time, it's not really surprising, is it, that word began to spread. There's this person over in Galilee, and if you have a loved one or you yourself are ailing, you need to go see this guy. He can heal anybody of anything. And news spread, as we read here in Matthew chapter 4. And so we also read in Luke 8:43 of a woman who had spent all her livelihood on physicians, such as they were at the time, I suppose, and could not be healed by any, and she comes in the crowd secretly without being noticed, she thinks, and just sort of reaches through the crowd and grabs a hold of Jesus' tunic, and she's healed. Do you think that word would spread? In Mark chapter 2 and verses 3 and 4, others came to Jesus, it said, bringing a paralytic. And when they could not come near him because of the crowd, they uncovered the roof. That is, they took the tiling off the roof and let the man down into the very presence, into Jesus' lap, I suppose, where he received help from Jesus. And so there are a variety of these sorts of references in the New Testament that captivated the imagination and the desire of people to be benefited by what Jesus could do for them. But let's dig in a little deeper in some detail. So let's look at Luke 7, verses 1 through 10. This is an interchange that Jesus has with a Roman centurion. In fact, the first couple of these that we'll talk about are unusual in that Jesus did not come and travel about through Gentile nations and interact with Gentiles on any kind of a broad basis. As he says to the second example that we'll look at, I did not come but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jesus came and did not stray very far from the Jewish homeland. But we find that he did interact at times with Gentiles, and this is an interaction that actually amazes Jesus. There's only 2 times in the New Testament it says Jesus marveled. This is one of them. When he sees the faith of the centurion, we'll not read through this because we did earlier, but when he sees the faith of the centurion, he marvels. So, what is the faith of this centurion like? Well, the story is unusual in a couple of different ways. Number one, it's unusual that a Gentile would reach out to a Jew for help. Again, we talked about the Samaritans in our first lesson this morning, but the Gentile world as a whole was considered inferior to the Jews by the Jews. They had no regard for Gentiles. They considered them to be pollutants. And yet, their land was dominated by Gentile forces, by the Romans. And so a Gentile reaching out to a Jew for help is unusual. But secondly, the Jews were advocating for the centurion. This man is worthy for you to help. That doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound very Jewish by what we know of the Jews at that point in time. Again, they had animosity toward the Gentiles, and yet we find in this passage that in verse 4, they begged Jesus earnestly, saying that the one for whom he should do this was worthy, for he loves our nation and has built us a synagogue. So this is not your normal Jew-Gentile interaction. I think what this is saying in essence is, like Cornelius that we read about later in the book of Acts, this centurion has come to realize the God of the Jews is someone superior than the gods of the Greeks and the gods of the Romans. This is a God that exists. This is a God that actually gives law, that makes sense, is rational. This is a God, in this case, who actually can act on someone's behalf. And so the centurion here sees value in Judaism. And thus, when he, however he did so, began to hear about Jesus, we're not told the backstory here, but he knows Jesus has something that he needs. And that is that he wants the servant, his own servant, the centurion, to be healed. It says in verse 2, who is very dear to him, and sick and ready to die. What is it that made Jesus marvel about this man? Well, number one, his humility. In verses 6 and 7, it says, Jesus went with those sent by the centurion, and when he was already not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I'm not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Therefore, I did not even think myself worthy to come to you, but say the word, and my servant will be healed. It's hard not to contrast that attitude with the attitude of the Jewish leaders of the day, who despised Jesus, who opposed him at every turn, who were arrogantly hanging on to their power and wanted Jesus removed as a threat to their fiefdom. But this man says, I did not even feel worthy that you should come under my roof. Therefore, I did not even think myself worthy to come to you. There's a humility here that is not only not common in that day, that's a humility that isn't common today. We're also encouraged by our cultural messaging to be individualized. It's all about me. And we hear about self-esteem, and we see people doing all kinds of things to draw attention to themselves, and being in various social chats and whatnot only exacerbates this. We want to put our best foot forward. We want everybody to think the best of us. We want to project an image. And that image is one of, I've got it all together, and I'm significant, and look at me. Now, the centurion was somebody. To have this role in the Roman army was a significant leadership position. And yet, look at the humility of this man. But that's not all. Look at what he says in verse 8. For I also am a man placed under authority, having soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. What is he saying there? What he's doing is acknowledging that Jesus has the power, has the authority to do whatever he would simply declare to be done. That's why Jesus was amazed. Jesus has been opposed at every turn, as we have already seen in previous lessons. To now see someone who has that kind of confidence in him, but a Gentile who has that kind of confidence in him, is truly amazing. And when Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him and said, what? I haven't seen this kind of faith in Israel. The people that had the Old Testament, the people that had the prophets sent to them, the people that had John the Baptist sent to them, as we discussed previously today, they had all of those advantages and all of that knowledge of God. And God had followed this plan, this promise, series of promises to Abraham all the way through the Old Testament, leading to their own day. They've got all of that history. And Jesus said, I haven't seen this kind of faith in all of Israel. This is so heartwarming because it reinforces the idea that no matter how bad the culture or the society may be, how prevalent idolatry was in that day, and Greek mythology and Roman mythology, the right heart can see through it. The right heart can see the truth. This Gentile sees the truth about Jesus. Let's look at another example. Matthew chapter 15. Matthew chapter 15. Again, this is a Gentile, described as a Syro-Phoenician woman. That means she is Syrian in heritage and ethnicity, She dwells on the seacoast to the northwest of Galilee, and this is in a period of time where Jesus, the opposition now has been ramped up against Jesus, not only in Judea, but Galilee. And so the majority of Jesus' work has now been done. This is a period sometimes called the withdrawal to the north, that Jesus leaves Galilee and begins to skirt around the outer edges because the opposition against him is intensifying. And so Jesus leaves Galilee, goes up to the coast, Tyre and Sidon, the area we might know from the Old Testament cities that are there. And he comes in contact with a Gentile woman. And here's what happens. Matthew chapter 15, verse 21. Then Jesus went out from there and departed to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a woman of Canaan came from that region and cried out to him, saying, Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed. Remember, I've already said not all of these questions end in a question mark. Sometimes it's a request. Sometimes it's a statement of challenge. But nonetheless, these are people prodding Jesus for a response. So when she says this, O Lord, have mercy on me, my daughter is severely demon-possessed, she's asking Jesus to do something. But he answered her not a word. Again, we've said Jesus doesn't often answer questions as we would expect or as the queerest would expect. Jesus doesn't say anything. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, Send her away, for she cries out after us. Mark notes in his gospel that she kept asking him to cast the demon out. And the disciples took that as being pestered. She was irritating them, and so they say, Send her away, she cries out after us. But he answered and said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Then she came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, help me. But he answered and said, It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs. What is he doing? This is not the Jesus that most people think about. He's harsh, cruel, callous. But she says, True, Lord. Yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table. Then Jesus answered and said to her, O woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire. And her daughter was healed from that very hour. What's Jesus doing? It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs. He's already ignored her. Then he said, I didn't come to serve the Gentiles. Then he calls her a Gentile dog. What's he doing? I think he's doing two things. Number one, he's testing her. And God will test us. He will not tempt us to sin. James makes that quite clear. God is not in the business of tempting us to sin. He is in the business of testing us so we'll grow. That's two completely different things. Satan wants us to go to hell. Satan wants us to sin. Satan wants us to turn away from God. God wants us to turn to him even stronger than we are. That's what he's doing for this woman. But you notice, as we said of the centurion, you notice her humility? What does she not do? Well, if that's the way you're going to talk to me, I thought you were somebody, and I thought you were a healer, and I've heard all these things about you. I'm leaving. Not at all. Her ego was not in the way. What she kept in sight, I think, through all of this is, I need help. My daughter needs help. Insult me if you will, but I still believe you can help. And I'm not going anywhere until you help me. Once again, that's what God is looking for. That's what Jesus is looking for. But I don't think that's all Jesus is doing. I think he's also teaching the disciples something. These men are going to be global ambassadors. They have been raised, they have been conditioned by their Jewish upbringing to hate the Gentiles. And where's Jesus going to send them? To the Gentiles. He's sending them as ambassadors to all nations. And what I think Jesus wants his disciples to see is there is faith outside of Israel, just like with the centurion. In fact, in some cases, there's greater faith outside of Israel. Don't you lose sight of that. Now, that's not expressly said, so that's my opinion. You can take it for what it's worth. But I do think that's really what he's trying to do. And their attitude, send her away, send her away. This is a woman Jesus identifies as having great faith. And what do the disciples do? Send her away. She's annoying us. They need a lesson. And he knows she can bear up under the test. He knows that. So he pushes her. Are we willing to let God push us and test us and still maintain our faith in him? Because in that moment, we may not realize what he's doing. We may not understand the connection between a no to our prayer or multiple no's to our prayer. We don't see what he's trying to do, and what he's trying to do is help us grow. How does faith react? How does faith react when it feels vulnerable? Not this morning, we're all sitting here with a group of Christians in this building. I think we're relatively safe. We're all singing and praying, and we feel good naturally. We should, about what we're doing together. Spiritually, this is a wonderful place to be this morning. What about when you're by yourself? And the pressure of a situation begins to grow, and there's no Christian in sight. And you are being tempted to sin. Or you just don't understand what's happened. You've been fired. You're in a car wreck. A loved one is sick. Faith's going to be challenged. Trust is going to be challenged. But real faith doesn't run away. It doesn't lash out. It doesn't accuse God of things he's not guilty of. Real faith seeks remedy and solution and blessing from God rather than becoming bitter and critical and accusatory. And we see this in two Gentiles. You remember when Paul went out as the apostle to the Gentiles, what the proportions were of those that responded to the gospel and entered the kingdom that were Gentile and those that were Jew? It's pretty well documented in the book of Acts. Okay, the second category, and then we'll close after examining this just for a moment or two, is not appeals for this kind of help of healing or casting out a demon, but appeals that were made to Jesus for further teaching. We've been talking about pursuing reality, understanding truth. That's the main quest that we're on. The truth about God, and the truth about ourselves, and the truth about other people, and the truth about God's Word, the truth, as we'll talk in our afternoon lesson, the truth about the future. But when we listen to Jesus, we really listen to Jesus, he speaks enigmatically, oftentimes, in figures, in symbols, and allusions to Old Testament prophecy or outright quotes of Old Testament prophets. In not directly answering a question that was asked. We've seen all of this in previous lessons. Even the disciples often misunderstood Jesus and sometimes didn't get the message until later. So, a couple of examples of that. John chapter 2 and verse 22. This is early on in Jesus' ministry, and he refers to his body as the temple. Destroy this body, destroy this temple, he says, and I'll raise it up in 3 days. And it says in John 2:22, when he had risen from the dead, quite a long time later than what we read in John 2, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this. They didn't get it at the time, and this is not unusual. Jesus says a lot of things that were not understood until later. In Mark chapter 9, verses 9 and 10, Mark says, he commanded them that they should tell no one the things that they had seen, till the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept this word to themselves, questioning what the rising from the dead meant. Remember, we said in an earlier lesson, Jesus had made it clear what was going to happen, but the disciples didn't process it. And probably because they do realize by now, he speaks in figures. He speaks symbolically, as we saw with Nicodemus, as we saw with the woman at the well. In Mark chapter 9, again, in verses 31 and 32, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of men. He will rise the third day. But they did not understand this saying and were afraid to ask him. Again, one of the main points we're trying to get across in this series is don't be afraid to ask questions of God. Just examine your heart and ask why you have that question. It may be perfectly legitimate why you have that question, but seek the answer with an honest heart. So there were times that the apostles heard things. They didn't understand what Jesus was actually saying. There are other times the apostles sought Jesus out for further explanation. In Matthew chapter 13, this is when Jesus sort of has a watershed shift in his teaching, and he begins to teach more in parables. So the disciples come to him in Matthew 13 and verse 10, and they say, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" In Matthew 13, verse 36, his disciples came to him, "Explain to us the parables of the tares." Matthew 17 and verse 10, this is after the transfiguration, his disciples asked, "Why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" Then the disciples understood that he spoke to them of John the Baptist. Matthew 17 and verse 13. Mark chapter 7 and verse 17, this is after the dispute over the washing of hands, or the failure to do so by the disciples. The record says in Mark 7:17, when he had entered a house away from the crowd, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. So he said to them, "Are you thus without understanding also?" Jesus seems a little bit piqued with their slowness to come around. Remember what we read about Nicodemus earlier today? Are you the teacher of Israel and you don't understand these things? Sometimes, when the disciples or Nicodemus, when they ask questions of Jesus, Jesus had the bar up here and they're down here, and he says, why are you not up where the bar is? This is where you should be. Is he talking to us? Why are you asking that question? I think I said last night, we say, no question is a bad question because we want people to ask questions. But some questions reveal that we're not where we ought to be. And Jesus points that out. You ought to be here and you're asking me this. It's kind of a wake-up call maybe for us. Mark chapter 9 and verse 28, this is after the disciples failed to cast out the demon while Jesus was on the Mount of Transfiguration with Peter, James, and John. He came back and the man is complaining because the disciples couldn't cast out the demon. It says, when he come into the house, his disciples asked him privately, saying, "Why could we not cast it out?" In Mark 10 and verse 10, this is on the discussion of over divorce and what Jesus says about restrictions of divorcing and remarrying. It says, in the house, his disciples asked him again about the same matter. Jesus' rigidity on divorce and remarriage was at odds with rabbinical doctrine. That's pointed out clearly in Matthew 19 as well, the Mark passage being a little bit different. But nonetheless, we need some clarity on that. So when they would get Jesus away from the crowds in the house, as it says, they would ask him. John chapter 9 and verse 2, when the man that was blind happened upon Jesus, his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" They're revealing a question there that, again, is worthy of a sermon or more. But we try to make sense of this world. We've said we're in a complex world. Things happen we don't understand. And sometimes we don't really understand cause and effect. And when people do something heinously sinful, or someone suffers some misfortune like this blind man, we want to make sense of that. God made us to be rational creatures, and we want to know, why is it this way? And so they're looking for some trigger, some cause that made this particular situation as it was. And we can really ponder that at a whole lot more time than we have time for this morning. It's an interesting question. One other, after the prophecy of Jerusalem's destruction. This is from Mark. It says, the disciples, that is Peter, Andrew, James, and John, came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be? Someone made a comment to me one time, and I had sort of a knee-jerk reaction to it, but it was, again, something that deserved, I'm sure, more discussion. Someone said to me, and said it sort of in a very positive tone, I take everything Jesus says at face value. And I would consider this person to be a mature Christian that said it. I take everything Jesus says at face value. I think what I should have said to him in response was, what do you mean by face value? I didn't say that. I should have said that. One of those things you think later what you should have said. My response was, I take very little that Jesus says at face value. Everything Jesus said is truth. Understand, everything Jesus said is truth. But when people took Jesus at face value, most of the time they were wrong. They drew the wrong conclusion. Jesus did speak symbolically. He did speak on a spiritual level that people weren't prepared for. He spoke about things that generally the men he was speaking to did not understand. They needed clarification. I'm not saying Jesus' words are not important. I'm not saying they're not authoritative, any of that. What I am saying is, you remember I used the analogy of the $20 bill lying on the parking lot, as opposed to the mine in which you have to go down and dig out the precious metals and gems. Jesus very often says things on a certain level that requires us to do a whole lot of digging to get the nugget out of it that he meant. When we just simply skim the surface or listen to him superficially, or as my brother said, take it face value, we might end up drawing the wrong conclusions. Instead, we need to do what the apostles did. They asked him. They dug. They questioned him. What do you mean by that? Explain that to us more. Some closing observations this morning. When people encountered Jesus, as we read in the Gospels, far more questioned him on the basis of doubt and confusion or challenge than questioned him for a real explanation. And Jesus made this observation in Luke 16:18. He said, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. I'm going to apply that general principle to this subject. What I mean by that is, there are people in the world who have a carnal objective, not a spiritual one, a carnal objective. And I'm thinking of rocket scientists. I'm thinking of people that deal with other forms of transportation or building skyscrapers or constructing a communication system that bounces messages off satellites. We've done some incredible things that it wasn't obvious on the surface how you pull this off. Many spend their lives, they work hard at getting an advanced education, spend their lives on building systems that leave the rest of us shaking our heads. And in the course of doing these kinds of things, these amazing technological wonders that are around all of us, they don't let obstacles get in their way. They figure out a way to overcome them. The sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than sons of light. Should not Christians take a lesson from this? It seems like to me sometimes that many people, professed believers, give up when confronted with a conundrum that they find unanswerable or troubling. They give up. They throw up their hands. Well, I don't know. I don't understand this. I'm in pain, and I don't seem to be able to find an answer. True faith is tenacious. It does not run into an obstacle or roadblock and immediately give up. If people in general did that, you and I wouldn't be talking to each other on cell phones or texting. Or as we were doing on the airplane coming the other day, we flew on Delta and you got this, screen on the back of the seat in front of you and you can start punching buttons. You can call it movies. You can look at documentaries. I'm a golf fan, so I watched a couple of old Masters tournaments. Flying, 6 miles in the air at 541 miles an hour, watching movies, breathing air, being comfortable, mostly, somewhat. I love being up in the air, but the whole flying experience, you can have it. There are people that devoted their whole life to overcoming obstacles so that we could get here in comfort. Do we get it? Are there going to be obstacles for us as Christians? Are there going to be conundrums? Are there going to be confusions? Yes. Questions we can't answer? Situations we wish were different? Don't know why God didn't answer my prayer or change the situation? Sure. Question is, are you certain enough about what you know about God to not let the things that you don't know about God throw you off the rails? That's the difference. Are you going to answer every question about life, about God? No. Do you have to? No. You have to have enough trust in what you know about God, that He's revealed about Himself, that you don't let those situations in life throw you off the beam. And I want us to also understand the nature of the healings that Jesus did when He was here, these pleas for help with various diseases and demon possessions and whatnot. Jesus' mission was not primarily concerned with eradicating disease and healing sick bodies. He did that, but that shows God's compassion on those that are suffering. But his objective was not to come and wipe out diseases. His objective was, in those miracles, to lay a foundation, to lay a bedrock assurance in the minds of men of who He said He was, and demonstrate that by His miraculous abilities. These miracles demonstrated both the power and character of God, His love, His compassion, His mercy. God knows we live in a world where not everything is going to go according to plan or expectation. During our time here in the last few days, we've learned about a very close friend of ours who is, as I speak, in a medically induced coma. She had near heart failure. She coded twice. They were trying to put stents in. She's younger than me. And we could all tell a story like that. This world is not our home. While we're here, things are going to happen. And God isn't going to run interference for everything and step in and solve every physical, material, earthly problem. He's going to give us the wherewithal to deal with those things. He's going to help us grow up spiritually so that these things do not deter us from what really matters, and that's going home to be with God in heaven. Peter says in 1 Peter 5:7, cast all your care upon Him, for He cares for you. Paul says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Philippians 4:6-7. He wrote that from prison. From prison. The apostle to the Gentiles, the one that wanted to be free to travel the world and spread the gospel. He's been in prison and probably been there somewhere around 5 years by then. And he tells us to pray and be anxious for nothing and be thankful. And that will fortify our minds. And then one more and we'll close. This is the Lord's invitation. I'm not issuing the preacher's invitation. This is the Lord's invitation. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. A yoke is something that enables you to work. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. That's what we're promised. That's what men were looking for when they truly understood who Jesus was, and they came to Him with their questions. They were, yes, some of them were looking for the healing of their bodies, but the ones that had the deepest insight were looking for the healing of their soul. And so this morning, if you're here and your soul needs healing, that might be through coming to the Lord, you've encountered Him, but you have never expressed your faith and commitment to Him. You've not confronted your sins and repented of them. You've not been willing to believe to the point of standing up and confessing with your mouth that He is the Son of God, and then live your life on that confession. Maybe you know all of that and you've not been baptized for the remission of your sins. For whatever your hang-up may be, is there an answer to what questions are keeping you from the Lord? Or if you have done those things and you started that walk and you strayed, the Lord hadn't gone anywhere. If there's separation, it's because you and I leave Him. And if that's you this morning, we'd love to help you as well. Would you come while we stand and sing?